For 35 years, a man walked free in South Bend, Indiana, going about his daily life just miles from where he brutally murdered a woman in her own home. And the whole time, detectives had his DNA but couldn't match it to anyone. Not a single person in any database, and the husband of the victim lived under a cloud of suspicion so thick that people would literally call him Slash when he walked into a room. Can you imagine that? Having your wife savagely killed and then being accused of doing it yourself. And the real killer is out there smoking cigarettes and living his life while you're being called a murderer everywhere you go. But this story, this case, it's about so much more than just DNA and databases. It's about a genetic genealogist who looked at what everyone else called impossible. A sample so small you couldn't see it with the naked eye. And said, I can solve this in 4 days, and she actually did it. But before we get to that miracle moment, before we talk about the cigarette butt that finally brought justice, we need to go back to February 19th, 1987, to a bowling alley in Niles, Michigan, where a woman named Roxanne Wood kissed her husband goodnight and drove home alone, having absolutely no idea that she had maybe 45 minutes left to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Roxanne was 30 years old, and if you asked anyone who knew her, they'd tell you she lit up every room she walked into. Tall, statuesque, dressed to the nines always. The kind of woman who made everyone feel like they were her best friend, even if they'd just met. Her younger brother Brad remembers her as his rock. Literally, they called her Rock, because when their parents divorced and life felt unstable and he felt shuffled between houses, Roxanne was the constant. She was the one who took on that maternal role, who made sure he felt loved and secure. And her younger sister Janet looked up to her in every possible way. Roxanne was more than a sister. She was a role model, someone who showed them how to move through life with grace and confidence and kindness. She'd married Terry Wood back in 1982, met him when she was working at his father's company right after high school. And Terry walked in wearing wrestling shorts because he was on the high school wrestling team. And Roxanne told her sister later that he had the nicest legs she'd ever seen, just absolutely smitten from that first moment. And Janet said Roxanne called her wedding day the happiest day of her life. 6 years later, both sisters would share the same last name. Wood, because Janet married Terry's brother Rob. So now it was really a family affair, both brothers working for the family business, both couples deeply intertwined in each other's lives. But here's the thing about working together and living together and being together constantly. It can put a strain on even the strongest marriage. And Roxanne felt it, so she did something smart. She took a job in nearby South Bend, Indiana, gave them both a little breathing room, a little independence, and it worked. By early 1987, they were content, happy even, looking forward to starting a family. Their marriage was in a good place, and February 19th seemed like just another normal Thursday night. They met for dinner after work at a restaurant in downtown Niles, then headed to a local bowling alley in separate cars, because that's just how they'd arranged it. Terry had his men's league night, and Roxanne came along because she enjoyed it. She enjoyed being around people, being social. And when she walked into that bowling alley, Detective Sergeant John Moore would later say you could tell from the reports that all eyes were on her. She was one of the few women there because this was the men's league. And she just had that presence, that magnetism. As midnight approached, Roxanne was ready to head home. She was tired, ready to call it a night. But Terry wanted to stay and bowl another game. So they said goodnight right there in front of witnesses. Hugged, kissed, said I love you, drive safe. All the normal things couples say to each other. And Roxanne got in her car and drove home, while Terry stayed behind to bowl one more game. And this detail, this timing, would become absolutely crucial later, because Terry would arrive home about 45 minutes after his wife. 45 minutes that would change everything. 45 minutes that would haunt him for 3.5 decades. Terry came home through the garage, like he always did. And the moment he stepped inside the house, he saw something that would scar him forever. His wife Roxanne lying on the kitchen floor in her nightgown. Blood everywhere, so much blood, according to Detective First Lieutenant Chuck Christensen. Terry said he rushed over to her, got behind her, picked her head up, held it in his hands, trying to see if she was alive, trying to find any sign of life, but there was nothing. She was gone. And he noticed immediately that her panties were down around her knee and ankle area. Her nightgown was pulled up, and he knew. He had to have known in that moment what had happened to her. He grabbed the phone and called the local police station. And that phone call, that piece of audio, it would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire case. Terry's voice comes through and he says, "She is dead. She has been cut, and the dispatcher is trying to help him, trying to get information, trying to keep him calm." And she says, "Now listen to me, okay? I'm going to get some information from you, and I'm going to get a car started." And Terry explodes. He says, "No, get 50 fucking cars started, goddammit, now." And the dispatcher says, "They are started." And Terry yells back, "No, they're not now, goddammit, now." And she's trying to explain that she needs to understand him, that he shouldn't scream into the phone because it distorts and she can't understand him well. And Terry says, "You mean so you can get a recording on it?" And she says, "No, I'm trying to get some information from you." And Terry says, "Yeah, right." And there's this anger in his voice, this rage. And for investigators, that anger became a huge red flag immediately. Detective Christensen would later say that typically, when someone finds their spouse dead, they're in shock, they're distraught. But you don't normally hear that anger component at the level it was in this call. And Detective Sergeant Jason Bailey says when police arrived at the house, Terry's fits of rage continued. He was screaming that he wanted a supervisor, wanted a sergeant there. And eventually, first responders had no choice but to restrain him. They put him in the back of a patrol car because he was just so out of control. And when they drove him down to the police post for routine questioning, Terry immediately asked for an attorney. And for investigators, that set off even more alarm bells. Why would an innocent man whose wife was just murdered immediately lawyer up? Why wouldn't he want to help find the killer? Why wouldn't he be cooperating fully? And here's where things get really dark, according to Janet. One of the detectives told Terry within 5 to 10 minutes, "You did this, and I will not rest until I put you away forever." Just straight up accused him of killing his own wife. Told him, "I believe you're the killer, and I will not rest until you're behind bars." And can you imagine being in Terry's position? You just found your wife brutally murdered. You're in shock. You're traumatized. And instead of sympathy, instead of help, you're being accused of being the monster who did it. As investigators started piecing together the crime scene, everything seemed to point to Terry as the killer. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, none. And that immediately raised eyebrows because how did someone get in? Terry told them they'd been having problems with the lock on the back door. Said it didn't work properly, but investigators were skeptical. They thought he was making excuses, and then there was the murder weapon, a fillet knife that had been taken from a kitchen drawer. The sheath was found near Roxanne's body, but the knife itself was never recovered. And Detective Christensen said it would be odd for a killer to come to a house without a weapon, implying that whoever did this knew where the knives were, knew the layout of the house, was comfortable enough to go through drawers and find a weapon. Terry told police he'd slipped in Roxanne's blood when he lifted her head to check if she was alive. But when investigators looked at the blood patterns, there were no smears indicating he'd actually done that. No evidence that supported his story about slipping and falling. And then they started digging into Roxanne and Terry's past. And what they found seemed to give them a motive. Both parties had been involved in extramarital affairs, both of them. And when you have a murder like this, and you learn there was infidelity, jealousy becomes an obvious potential motive. Detective Christensen said that's absolutely what they were wondering. Could jealousy have driven Terry to kill his wife in a fit of rage? One of the detectives made this statement that stuck with Janet forever. He said, It was rage. Only someone close to her would have this kind of rage. But Janet never bought it. She knew Terry too well. She was married to his brother. She saw him all the time, and she said Terry wasn't a rageful guy. He might have a sharp tongue occasionally, but he was never violent. Never someone who would do something like this. But her belief in his innocence didn't matter to investigators. They were convinced they had their man. They just needed to prove it. The problem was, despite how strongly they suspected Terry, prosecutors didn't believe there was enough evidence to charge him. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no physical evidence directly tying him to the murder. So after just a few months of investigation, the case went cold, just completely cold. But that cloud of suspicion never lifted from Terry's head. Detective Jason Bailey would later say he'd heard stories about Terry walking into places and people calling him Slash, right to his face or behind his back. They nicknamed him after what had been done to his wife. Can you imagine living with that, being called a murderer? Being called Slash, having people look at you like you're a monster when you're actually a victim yourself. When you're grieving the loss of your wife and trying to move forward with your life. But here's the thing that should have cleared Terry immediately. Here's the thing that should have ended all the speculation. There was DNA left at the crime scene. Semen that clearly came from whoever raped and killed Roxanne. And that sample was preserved, but this was 1987. DNA technology was in its infancy. They couldn't do much with it back then, so it just sat there. Sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up. Waiting for someone to be able to analyze it properly, and Roxanne's family never gave up hope. Janet said she didn't lose hope ever. She said, this guy just didn't do this, and then lead a clean, pristine life the rest of his life. She believed eventually they'd catch him. Eventually justice would come. As years passed, DNA technology evolved dramatically, and in 1999, 12 years after the murder, the preserved sample was finally able to be uploaded to CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, and everyone held their breath waiting for a match, waiting for the system to ping and tell them who killed Roxanne Wood. But nothing happened. No match came back. The killer wasn't in the system. But at least now they could test it against Terry's DNA. At least now they could finally clear the husband who'd been living under suspicion for over a decade. So they ran the test, compared Terry's DNA to the sample from the crime scene. And the result was exactly what Janet and Brad and everyone who knew Terry expected. It wasn't his DNA, it wasn't even close. The semen found in Roxanne did not come from her husband. So you'd think that would be it. Right. You'd think that would finally clear Terry. Finally lift that cloud of suspicion. His DNA doesn't match. He's not the killer. Case closed on that front. But Detective Christensen said no. Terry was still not eliminated as a person of interest. Still not cleared as a suspect, and when pressed on why. When asked how can it not be him when it's not his semen, Christensen said, just because you find semen in somebody doesn't necessarily mean that that person is the one that killed them, suggesting that maybe someone else raped Roxanne and then Terry killed her. Or maybe Terry hired someone. Or maybe there were two attackers. They were reaching, desperately reaching, to keep Terry in their crosshairs because they'd been so convinced from day one that he did it. And now even with DNA evidence clearing him, they couldn't let it go. For Terry, this was torture, absolute psychological torture, cleared by science, but still blamed by investigators, still whispered about by neighbors, still called Slash by people who should have known better. And the case just sat there cold and unsolved. From 1999 through the 2000s, through the 2010s, 20 years of nothing, 20 years of Roxanne's family waiting for answers, waiting for justice, waiting for someone to finally figure out who really killed their sister, their rock. The woman who made everyone feel loved and special. And then in 2020, something interesting happened, something that would eventually crack this case wide open. But it didn't have anything to do with DNA at first. It had to do with paperwork. Mountains and mountains of paperwork, see? After more than 3 decades of investigation, police had compiled thousands and thousands of reports, 3,500 pages of documents, witness statements, crime scene photos. interview transcripts, forensic reports, tips from the public, everything you could imagine. And these files were just sitting there in boxes, disorganized, overwhelming, nearly impossible to search through efficiently. If a detective wanted to find information about a specific person or location, they'd have to literally flip through thousands of pages, hoping to stumble across it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when Dr. Ashlyn Kirsten enters the story. She's a professor at Western Michigan University who teaches criminal justice studies, and she'd been talking with Detective Christensen for years about creating some kind of partnership, about how her students might be able to help with cold cases, give them real-world experience while also providing valuable assistance to law enforcement. And they came up with this brilliant plan. Dr. Kirsten's students would take all those 3,500 pages of documents and process them into a single, digitized database. Something searchable, something functional, something that would allow officers to search by name and see if someone had already been interviewed. If they needed follow-up, they could search locations, dates, anything they needed, things they wouldn't be able to do just flipping through thousands of pages. Samantha Rogers was one of the students who worked on the Roxanne Wood case, and she talks about how meaningful it was to be able to contribute something tangible, to know that their work was making a real difference. And another student, Mackenzie Stomman, said the decades-old files were a solemn reminder of how long some victims wait for justice. It gave them a sense of gravity about what they were doing. These cases had gone unsolved for so long, and here they were, college students, potentially helping to finally solve them. But while the students were organizing paperwork, Detective Christensen was preparing to make his Hail Mary pass, his last, desperate attempt to solve this case before he retired. Before he had to admit defeat, he reached out to Colleen Fitzpatrick, who's the president and founder of Identifinders International, a company that specializes in genetic genealogy. This relatively new field that had been making headlines by solving impossible cases, identifying unknown remains, catching violent offenders who'd been free for decades. And Christensen thought maybe, just maybe, this could work for Roxanne's case. Maybe they could use that tiny DNA sample they'd preserved back in 1987 and find the killer through his family tree. So Fitzpatrick and her team got to work. They took that DNA sample and tried to extract enough information to build a genetic profile. But what they found was shocking. There was what Fitzpatrick called a gnat's eyebrow of DNA left, about 3% of what they normally use, the lowest amount of DNA they'd ever attempted to work with to solve a case. It was essentially microscopic, invisible to the naked eye. A speck so small you'd need specialized equipment just to confirm it existed. And they worked on it for 10 months, 10 full months of trying to extract enough data, trying to build a profile, trying to find any way to make this work. But they came up empty, completely empty. It really did feel impossible, Fitzpatrick said. It felt like they'd finally hit a case that couldn't be solved. Then in April 2021, Fitzpatrick happened to be chatting with Gabriela Vargas, an investigative genetic genealogist who worked as a consultant for Identifinders. Just casual conversation, and Fitzpatrick mentioned this impossible case, this tiny sample that nobody could do anything with. And Vargas said something that would change everything. She said, "Well, why don't you let me look at it?" And Fitzpatrick probably thought, okay, sure, why not? Nothing to lose at this point. But Vargas wasn't just being polite. She genuinely believed she could solve it. She said later, "I concluded that I did not stand with the others. I believed that this case was extremely solvable, and I believed that I could solve it." Now think about that for a second. Here's a DNA sample that a team of experts worked on for 10 months and couldn't crack. A sample so small, it's literally called a gnat's eyebrow. And this woman looks at it and says, "I can solve this. Not I'll try, not maybe, but I believe I can solve this." And what makes this even more remarkable is what comes next. Because Vargas wasn't exaggerating, she wasn't being overconfident. She actually did solve it, and she did it in 4 days. 4 days to do what everyone else said was impossible. 4 days to bring justice to a woman who'd been waiting 34 years. Here's how she did it. Vargas was able to generate a genetic profile from that tiny DNA sample, and that profile told her things about the killer's ancestry. Where his ancestors came from, was he Eastern European, Mediterranean, African American? What was his ethnic background? And what she determined was that the killer was Caucasian. That was her starting point. And from there she turned to online DNA services. See, when regular people use sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, they can take their results and upload them to a broader database called GEDmatch. And the important thing about GEDmatch is that people can choose to opt into law enforcement matching. If they do that, genetic genealogists working on criminal cases can see if they're a match to their suspect, if they share DNA with the killer. So Vargas uploaded the killer's genetic profile to GEDmatch and started looking for matches, looking for distant relatives who'd opted in. And she found them. She started building a family tree, going back generation after generation after generation. And she showed this to Peter Van Sant from 48 Hours Later, showed him the family tree on her computer, pointing out how on one side the ancestor was born in 1823, on the other side the top ancestor was 1797. She was going back 200 years, building this massive family tree, looking for where different branches connected to each other, looking for what's called a union couple, which is where two sides of the family tree meet, and she found them. She found this union couple born around 1920, and based on that, she could presume they would have had kids around 1940, maybe 1950, so the killer would have to be one of their children, one of the sons or grandsons of this couple, and when she looked at their descendants, she found that this couple had 3 sons, 3 possible suspects, and she let the detectives know, gave them the names, and now it was up to law enforcement to narrow it down, to do background checks, to figure out which of these 3 brothers was their killer. Detective Moore and his team got to work immediately. They ran background checks on all 3 brothers, looking for criminal records, violent behavior, anything that might connect them to Roxanne's murder, and they were able to eliminate 2 of the 3 brothers pretty quickly. Their backgrounds didn't fit. They didn't have the right history. So that left them with 1 brother, the last one. And when Detective Moore talks about this guy, you can hear the disgust in his voice. He says he's been involved in a lot of different things. A lot of horrible, violent things, sexual deviant things, you name it. He's probably been involved in it. And when you connect the DNA with someone who has a history of violent behavior, Detective Moore says, you've got yourself a suspect. Absolutely. The man's name was Patrick Gilham, and he was living just a few miles from where he allegedly raped and murdered Roxanne Wood. Just a few miles. He'd been there the whole time, living his life, and now finally, 34 years later, they had him, they knew who he was, they knew where he was. They just needed to confirm it was really him, needed to get his DNA and match it to the crime scene sample. But first, let me tell you about Patrick Gilham's past, because what detectives discovered when they dug into his history was absolutely chilling. Gilham had been a drinker. He was into drugs. Detective Christensen describes him as an individual who was lost in life, just a bad person based on his background. But it was worse than that, much worse. Because when detectives dug into his criminal history, they found a connection to another disturbing case. A case that happened 8 years before Roxanne's attack, back in September 1979 in Gary, Indiana. Robert Farag and his wife Maureen were living in Gary with their 2 young daughters. Robert was economic director for the city. Maureen was an art teacher at the local middle school. They were blossoming into adulthood, Robert says, building their life together, raising their kids, both of them working jobs they loved. And Maureen was the kind of person people just gravitated toward. Robert talks about her with so much love in his voice, says she was very attractive, which caught his eye. But she was also so nice, so warm, had this personality that just drew people in. One night, Robert was on his way home from a business trip, and he called Maureen asking her to leave the side door open because he didn't have his keys. Simple request, happens all the time, and Maureen said sure, no problem. And she left that door unlocked for her husband, having no idea what was about to happen. No idea that someone was watching, waiting, and around 11 p.m. Robert turned onto his street heading home, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There were police cars everywhere, parked in front of his house, lights flashing, and he pulled up panicking, rushed inside and found Maureen, and she was calm, remarkably calm considering what had just happened, and she told him the story. She'd been in bed when she heard a noise downstairs, got up to investigate, and she saw this guy going through her purse, just standing there rifling through her things, and when he realized she'd seen him, he got scared and chased her. Maureen started going upstairs trying to get away, and he grabbed her at the bottom of the stairs, got on top of her, tried his best to molest her, tried to rape her right there. But he wasn't successful. Maureen fought him off, and throughout this entire attack, Maureen stayed quiet. She didn't scream, didn't yell for help, because her 2 daughters, ages 1 and 3, were sleeping upstairs, and she didn't want to wake them. She didn't want them to see this, to be traumatized by this. Peter Van Sant from 48 Hours would later say that takes an incredible amount of courage. She was willing to sacrifice herself there, if need be, to protect her daughters. And Robert says yes, Maureen had a lot more than courage. She had strength. After the attack, the man grabbed Maureen's purse and fled, just ran out of the house, and about a week later, Patrick Gillam was pulled over in Gary for a traffic violation. Just a routine traffic stop, nothing major, but the police officer noticed credit cards on the seat next to him, and those credit cards belonged to Maureen Farag. So the officer called Robert and said, "We picked the guy up. We're bringing him into the station." And when police interviewed Gilham, when they asked him what happened, he said, "All I remember is going into the house, and I blacked out and woke up with my pants around my ankles." Claimed he didn't remember attacking Maureen, didn't remember trying to rape her, just blacked out and woke up with his pants down. Patrick Gillam was charged with burglary and unlawful deviant conduct. He pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced to 14 years in Indiana State Prison. And Robert and Maureen tried to move on with their lives. Robert says they forgot about it. They changed their house, changed their neighborhood, started fresh somewhere else. And Maureen never told anybody about what happened because she felt it was a private issue. She didn't want people to know, didn't want to talk about it. Just wanted to put it behind her and move forward. But here's the thing that should terrify you. Patrick Gilham served just 7 years of his 14-year sentence. 7 years out of 14, and about 4 months after his release from prison. Police believe he attacked Roxanne Wood. Detective Christensen has this theory about what happened. He says criminals learn as they go, and he believes Gillam learned from that first crime he committed that I better not leave this witness alive, because I will be in prison for a long time. With Maureen Farag, he left her alive. She identified him, he went to prison, so when he attacked Roxanne Wood, he made sure there wouldn't be any witnesses. He made sure she couldn't identify him. He slit her throat and left her to die on her kitchen floor. And Maureen Farag died in 2018 from cancer, never knowing anything about the Roxanne Wood case, never knowing that the man who attacked her had gone on to kill someone else, had escalated from attempted rape to murder. Now armed with DNA evidence pointing to Patrick Gilham, investigators were ready to move in, but they couldn't just arrest him yet. They needed to confirm that the DNA from the crime scene actually matched Gillam's DNA. They needed a direct sample from him to compare. And Detective Christensen says, at this point, we decide to get a surreptitious sample to compare to the profile we had from Roxanne Wood from the scene. And we do this through our undercover surveillance team, Enter Trooper Ryan Code, who works with the Michigan State Police Fugitive Recovery Team and does undercover work. And in May 2021, Code and his team started surveilling Patrick Gillam in South Bend, just following him around day after day, watching his movements, looking for an opportunity to collect his DNA without him knowing. And they picked up a crucial clue that would help them. They noticed that Gilham was a smoker, And code says that's perfect. Because when you're smoking, it's a great source of DNA. You have your lips directly on the cigarette butt. Your saliva gets in the cigarette. It's ideal for DNA collection. So now they're hot on Gilham's tail, watching him, waiting for their moment, and then it happens. They witness Gilham flick a cigarette butt out his truck window while he's driving. Just tosses it onto the street like people do. And for the surveillance team, this is the moment they've been waiting for. This is the final piece of the puzzle. Detective Christensen says he was rubbing his hands together thinking, this is it. This is what we need. So they rush over, collect the cigarette butt, send it to the lab right away, and then they wait. They wait for the lab to confirm what they already believe, that this DNA matches the crime scene, that Patrick Gilham is Roxanne Wood's killer. A couple days later, the lab director calls Detective Moore, and what he says is devastating. He says, it's not a match. The DNA from the cigarette butt doesn't match the DNA from Roxanne's killer, and Moore says DNA is DNA. If it's not a match, it's not a match. There's no arguing with science, so now they're all scratching their heads, confused, frustrated. How is this possible? Everything points to Gilham. The genetic genealogy led them straight to him. His criminal history fits perfectly, and yet the DNA doesn't match. Moore calls the trooper who grabbed the cigarette. Button asks, is there any way at all that you lost sight of it when it flipped out of his finger? And the trooper admits a car drove by right then, meaning it's possible, however unlikely, that the cigarette butt they tested wasn't actually Gilham's. Maybe it got mixed up with another cigarette butt on the street. Maybe they grabbed the wrong one. It's a long shot, but it's the only logical explanation. So Detective Christensen says, the only thing logically that we can do is go back and get another one. They need a second sample. They need to be absolutely sure this time. So Trooper Ryan Codd heads back to South Bend, back to surveilling Patrick Gilham, and this time Coddy is determined not to lose sight of that cigarette butt for even a moment. Not even for a second. He's going to make sure they get the right sample. And Gilham eventually pulls into a laundromat. And Coddy sees this as a window of opportunity. He figures Gilham will probably come out to take a smoke break, and instead of tailing him in a car this time, Codd decides to follow him on foot, to get up close and personal. Now, Codd isn't a smoker, never has been, but there's a gas station right on the corner near the laundromat. So Codd goes over and buys a pack of cigarettes. Figures he needs to blend in, needs to look natural. And then he sits on the curb right next to the laundromat, just waiting, and sure enough, Gilham comes outside to have a smoke. And he takes a seat probably about 6 to 8 feet away from Codd. So now Codd is sitting there having a smoke with the man they believe murdered Roxanne Wood. Just two guys on a curb, completely casual. Coddy strikes up a conversation, tries to keep it light and natural, just small talk. And it turns out Gilham likes the Red Wings. They chat about hockey, about nothing important really. And Codd is just waiting, watching, making sure he doesn't lose sight of Gilham's cigarette. And it's not long before Gilham finishes his smoke and gets up to go back inside the laundromat. And Codd sees exactly where Gilham throws his cigarette, right in a specific area. And the beautiful thing is, the cigarette is by itself. There are no other butts around it, no confusion about which one is Gilham's. So the moment Gilham goes back inside, Coddy pulls out a glove, walks over, picks up that cigarette with his gloved hand, and it's still warm, still smoking, just been dropped seconds ago. And Coddy wraps it up inside the glove, sticks it in his pocket, and heads out. They send this second cigarette butt to the lab, and this time, everyone's holding their breath. This has to be it. This has to match. And when the results come back, they're perfect. It's a perfect match to the DNA left at the 1987 crime scene. Patrick Gilham's DNA matches the semen found in Roxanne Wood, and Detective Christensen says he was ecstatic, very, very happy. After 34 years, they finally have scientific proof of who killed Roxanne. But investigators aren't ready to arrest Gilham just yet. They want to interview him first, see if he'll confess, see what he has to say. So in July 2021, they bring him in for questioning. And Detective Bailey makes it clear, you're not in trouble. You're here voluntarily. They tell him they need to question him about an old case. And Bailey says, do you know anybody by the name of Roxanne? And Gilham thinks about it and says, I know two Roxannes. One's a stripper, one's a drug addict. Doesn't mention Roxanne Wood at all, so they show him a picture of Roxanne, a more recent photo, and ask, does this girl look familiar? Have you ever met her before? And Gilham says, nope, never met her. So they show him a second photo, an older picture of Roxanne, and ask again. And Gilham shakes his head, no. Never seen her, never met her, doesn't know who she is. And that's when Bailey says, well, we're here to talk to you about her. This woman's been assaulted. And watch what happens next. Watch Gilham's reaction. Because Detective Bailey says you could see his body just tense up, almost to the point of hyperventilation. His hands started shaking. He threw his hands back in the air, waving them around. And Bailey says in 23 years of doing this, of interviewing suspects, he'd never had a reaction out of somebody like that. Never seen someone go from calm to completely panicked in a split second like Gilham did. And then Gilham says it. The words every detective knows means the interview is over. He says, this is too much for me, man. I gotta talk to my lawyer. And he keeps repeating it. I gotta talk to my lawyer, man. And that's it, the interview ends. But that reaction, that physical response when shown Roxanne's photo, that told investigators everything they needed to know. An innocent person doesn't react that way. An innocent person who's never met the victim doesn't hyperventilate and demand a lawyer the second you mention an assault. In February 2022, just days before the 35th anniversary of Roxanne's murder, Patrick Gilham was arrested at his South Bend, Indiana home. And when Roxanne's brother Brad got the news, he says it didn't seem real. It was nothing like he'd ever imagined. He'd played this moment out in his mind, probably thousands of times over 35 years. Imagined how he'd feel when they finally caught the killer. But when it actually happened, he was numb, couldn't process it, couldn't believe it was finally over. Detective Christensen then did something that was long overdue, something that should have happened decades earlier. He sat down face to face with Terry Wood, the man who'd lived for 35 years under a cloud of suspicion, and he told Terry, you are no longer a person of interest. We know you had nothing to do with it. And Terry just broke down, started crying, was bewildered and in shock. This weight he'd been carrying for over 3 decades was finally lifted. He could finally stop being Slash, could finally stop defending himself, could finally grieve his wife properly without people thinking he was the one who killed her. When they arrested Gilham, investigators questioned him for 5.5 hours at a police station in South Bend, and Gilham only asked for an attorney at the very end of that interview. Spent most of the time talking, going in circles, saying things that didn't quite make sense. At times he'd say, I can't believe I did it, if I did it. But you're saying I did so. And Detective Christensen says when they pressed him on it. Gilham just kept saying, you guys are telling me I did this, and if I did this, I'm a monster, over and over. I'm a monster, man. If I did that, that's a monster, man. Only a monster would do this. Detectives ask him, how do you think your DNA was found with her? And Gilham says, I have no clue. I have no clue, man. And he says several times during the interview, when confronted with case facts, I don't remember, man, I told you, I don't remember doing that. But Janet Wood says Gilham's reaction 7 months earlier, when they first questioned him and showed him Roxanne's photo, proved he was lying now. She says he visibly reacted, shook like a leaf, leaned back in his chair, pounded his chest, said he needed a lawyer. And Janet says, you tell me he doesn't remember what he did. You tell me that reaction was from someone who has no memory of this crime. Patrick Gilham was charged with Roxanne Wood's murder. But here's something that'll make your blood boil. Here's an opportunity to catch him that was completely missed. Because in the summer of 1987, just months after Roxanne was murdered, Gilham crossed paths with yet another woman. And this time he almost got caught, should have gotten caught. Would have gotten caught if things had gone just slightly differently. It was a hot night in South Bend when Rose Caparel went outside to water her front lawn, just doing normal evening yard work, and she heard this loud car coming down the street. Looked up and saw a blue El Camino driven by a stranger, and she noticed it had a taillight out, just one detail that stuck with her. And the car drove past, and Rose went back to watering. But about 3 or 4 minutes later, she heard the same car coming back down the street. Same loud muffler, same vehicle, and she got a feeling. Something was off about this situation. Rose started heading toward her front door, wanted to get inside, and by the time she got halfway there, a man came around the corner of her house. He had a stocking cap on, a full beard. All you could basically see were his eyes. And Rose just turned and ran, screaming down the street. And she says she's not a runner, never has been. But she ran faster in that moment than she'd ever run in her life. Pure adrenaline and fear driving her forward. And she made it to a neighbor's house and called the police. But by the time they could respond, the attacker had escaped. Just disappeared into the night. A few days later, Rose and her family were driving to dinner. And her daughter Tina spotted that same blue El Camino with the burned-out taillight in a parking lot. Just sitting there, and Tina's mom immediately recognized it. Said, "That's the car." So they went to call the police. But they left Rose's husband Stan waiting in the parking lot. And Stan was a retired Marine, not someone you want to mess with. And when the owner of the El Camino came back, Stan was there holding a gun at him, made the man sit on the ground, demanded he hand over his driver's license. And the name on that license was Patrick Gilham. Tina says they'd never heard the name before. Meant nothing to them. And Rose says they waited for police to show up, but they never came. Never arrived, so eventually Stan lowered his gun and let Gilham leave. And Rose later went to the South Bend police station to report the incident. Figured they'd be doing something with it. Figured there'd be a follow-up, an investigation, something. But no arrest was ever made. Nothing ever came of it. And Rose says we didn't pursue it because we figured they would be doing something with it. They trusted the system to work, trusted that police would investigate. And here's the tragedy of it. Peter Van Sant says, imagine if the police had come that night. Imagine if they'd arrested Gilham when Stan had him at gunpoint. They might have solved Roxanne Wood's case just a few months after it occurred, might have connected him to her murder, might have prevented whatever other crimes he committed over the next 35 years. Detective Christensen admits, yeah, it's possible it could have gone that way. An opportunity lost, a chance to get justice that just slipped through their fingers because police didn't show up when they were called. But finally, in April 2022, 35 years after he murdered Roxanne Wood, Patrick Gilham's day of reckoning arrived. He walked into a Michigan courtroom, and Rose Caparel was there, the woman who'd run screaming from him back in 1987. And when Gilham walked in, Rose openly said, "Piece of shit," loud enough for people to hear. She didn't realize she was saying it as loudly as she did, but she meant every word. This was the man who'd terrorized her, who'd come around the corner of her house wearing a stocking cap and full beard. And now, finally, he was going to face consequences. Janet Wood was there too, Roxanne's sister, and she says Gilham made eye contact with her, sat down and looked up and stared right in her face. And can you imagine what that must have been like for her? Looking into the eyes of the man who killed her sister, the man who'd robbed her of 35 years with Roxanne, who'd put her family through decades of pain and uncertainty and grief. And even though Gilham had insisted to investigators that he didn't remember murdering Roxanne, even though he'd played this game of, I can't believe I did it if I did it, he later pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, which legally means he wasn't admitting guilt, but also wasn't contesting the charges, essentially saying you prove whatever you want to prove. I'm not fighting it. And now everyone in that courtroom waited for his sentence to be handed down, waited to hear how many years Patrick Gilham would spend behind bars for what he'd done. Brad Woods talks about sitting there and saying it was almost like being face to face with the devil. He remembers being shaky and nervous, couldn't believe he was sitting that close to the person who did this. The person who killed his rock. The person who'd haunted his family for 35 years. And according to Brad, Gilham appeared confused when looking at Janet, almost like he'd seen a ghost, because Janet looks a lot like Roxanne. They're sisters. They have similar features. And Gilham was probably in shock seeing her sitting there. Probably thought for a moment he was seeing Roxanne herself somehow. Brad and Janet finally got their chance to address Gilham directly, to tell him exactly what they thought of him, what his actions had done to their family. And Janet went first, wearing headphones so Gilham could hear through his hearing device. And she said, "Patrick Gilham is the very definition of a nightmare. Women fear our whole lives." And she talked about how his actions gave all of them a life sentence, while he got to live his as a free man for 35 years, got to walk around, smoke his cigarettes, live just miles from where he'd killed Roxanne. And she said, "We are here today to see him finally pay something for what he's done, which is likely the rest of his life in a cage like the violent animal that he is." Then Brad spoke, and his words were even more pointed, even more direct. He said, "It seems like people like him find Jesus in prison, but don't bother looking because the devil will be the only one greeting you," essentially telling Gilham, don't even try to pretend you're going to reform. Don't even try to act like you're going to find redemption. Because we all know what you are. We all know you're going straight to hell. And there's nothing you can do or say that's going to change that. When it was Gilham's turn to speak, when the judge gave him the opportunity to say whatever he wanted before sentencing, Gilham offered an apology and a prayer. He said, "I can't believe I did what I did. And I pray for them every night. I'm so sorry. I just hope that sometime in the future, with God's help, that they can start to forgive me." And you have to wonder what was going through the minds of Roxanne's family members when they heard that. This man who'd shown Roxanne no mercy, who'd raped her and slit her throat and left her to die on her kitchen floor, now asking for forgiveness, now saying he prays for them every night, now playing the remorseful criminal routine that we've all seen 1,000 times. The judge sentenced Gilham, who was 67 years old at the time, to a minimum of 23 years in prison, which means with good behavior he'll be eligible for release in 2040. He'll be 86 years old. Essentially, he's going to die in prison. And that's exactly what he deserves. That's the absolute minimum of what justice looks like in this case. And sitting in that courtroom watching all of this unfold was Terry Wood, finally vindicated after 35 years, finally able to watch as his wife's real killer was led away in handcuffs. Robert Farag was there too, the man whose wife Maureen had been attacked by Gilham back in 1979. And Robert witnessed Terry's pain firsthand. He went up to Terry after the sentencing and shook his hand. And he says Terry was shaking, crying, just overwhelmed with emotion. And Robert says, "I felt more empathy for him than I could for any other person I've met. Because Robert understood. He knew what it was like to be victimized by Patrick Gilham, knew what it was like to have your life torn apart by this man's violence. But at least Robert's wife had survived. At least Maureen had lived. Terry lost everything, lost his wife, lost 35 years to suspicion and rumors, and being called Slash by people who should have known better. Terry was cleared, his wife's killer found. And it happened thanks, in large part, to advances in technology, thanks to genetic genealogy, thanks to Gabriela Vargas, who looked at what everyone else called impossible and said, "I can solve this in 4 days." And she did. She actually did it. Took a DNA sample the size of a gnat's eyebrow and traced it back through 200 years of family history to find Patrick Gilham. And Peter Van Sant asked her about the burden of this. The weight of knowing that more and more law enforcement agencies will be coming to her. More and more families hoping she can do her miracle work and solve their cold cases. And Vargas says it's not a burden at all, it's an honor. It's an honor to be able to work these cases, to bring justice to victims and closure to families. And she says, "I will never stop. We'll never stop fighting for victims like Roxanne Wood." As the Wood family finally found some peace, as they finally got answers after 35 years of waiting and wondering and grieving, Janet remembered a dream she'd had about Roxanne, and she talks about it with such clarity, such detail, says they were in downtown Niles, and Roxanne came up and grabbed her. Said Janet, and Janet was shocked, said Rock, "Oh my God." And they were walking and just laughing, having this beautiful moment together. And all of a sudden Janet looked up, and it was dead silent. They were at the gates of the cemetery, and Janet said, "Oh, do you have to go back?" And Roxanne said, "Yes, but it's fine, I'm good, I'm really good," and that was it. The dream ended, but Janet took comfort in it, took it as a sign that Roxanne was at peace, that she knew justice had finally been served, that she could rest now. But let's talk about what this case really means, about what it teaches us. Because there are layers here that go way beyond just DNA evidence and genetic genealogy. This case is about how the system failed Roxanne Wood at nearly every turn, how investigators got so focused on the husband that they couldn't see past their own biases, couldn't consider that maybe, just maybe, Terry Wood was telling the truth, that he really did come home and find his wife murdered, that his anger on that 911 call wasn't the anger of a guilty man trying to cover his tracks, but the anger of a devastated husband who was in shock and trauma. Think about how differently this case could have gone if investigators had kept an open mind, if they hadn't immediately zeroed in on Terry and ignored everything that pointed away from him. The DNA evidence that excluded him should have been the end of it, should have immediately shifted the investigation to finding the real killer. But instead, they doubled down, said, well, just because we found someone else's semen doesn't mean Terry didn't kill her. And that kind of tunnel vision, that refusal to admit when you're wrong, it destroys lives. It absolutely destroys innocent people's lives. Terry Wood lost 35 years to suspicion, 35 years of being called Slash, 35 years of people whispering behind his back, avoiding him at the grocery store, crossing the street when they saw him coming. 35 years of carrying this burden that he shouldn't have had to carry. And no amount of vindication can give him those years back. No amount of, we were wrong, you're not a suspect anymore, can undo the damage that was done to his reputation, to his mental health, to his ability to grieve his wife properly. And think about Patrick Gillam, walking free for 35 years, living just miles from where he murdered Roxanne, going about his daily life, smoking his cigarettes, driving his vehicles, probably not giving a second thought to what he'd done because he'd gotten away with it. He'd learned from his first attack on Maureen Farag that leaving witnesses alive gets you caught, gets you sent to prison. So he escalated. He made sure Roxanne couldn't identify him, made sure she couldn't testify against him, made sure there was no way she could send him back to prison. And it worked. He walked away clean, or at least he thought he did. He had no idea that tiny DNA sample was sitting in storage, waiting for technology to advance, waiting for someone like Gabriela Vargas to come along and do the impossible. And that's the thing about DNA evidence that criminals from that era didn't understand, didn't factor into their planning. They thought if they could just get away in the moment, if there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no obvious evidence, they were home free. But DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't forget. DNA just sits there patiently waiting for science to catch up, waiting for the day when that microscopic sample can tell the whole story. And this case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence, even when it seems like there's nothing you can do with it, even when the technology doesn't exist yet to analyze it properly. Because back in 1987, that DNA sample was essentially useless. They couldn't extract enough information from it to do anything meaningful. Couldn't upload it to databases that didn't exist yet. Couldn't use genetic genealogy because that wasn't even a concept yet. But they preserved it anyway. They stored it properly. They made sure it was kept in conditions that would maintain its integrity. And 34 years later, that decision to preserve that evidence paid off in the biggest possible way. Think about all the cold cases out there right now, all the unsolved murders and rapes and assaults where evidence was collected but couldn't be analyzed properly at the time. where investigators did their best with the technology they had, but came up empty. How many of those cases could be solved today with modern DNA analysis, with genetic genealogy, with the tools that Gabriela Vargas used to crack Roxanne Wood's case? How many families are still waiting for answers that are actually sitting in evidence storage, somewhere just waiting for someone to take another look with fresh eyes and new technology? And let's talk about the missed opportunities in this case, because there were several moments where Patrick Gilham could have been caught, should have been caught, would have been caught if things had gone just slightly differently. Rose Caparel's encounter with him in 1987, just months after he murdered Roxanne, when her husband Stan held Gilham at gunpoint and got his driver's license. If police had responded that night, if they'd investigated that incident properly, they might have connected Gilham to Roxanne's murder immediately, might have run his name through their system and seen his prior conviction for attacking Maureen Farag, might have put two and two together, but police never came, never followed up, and Gilham walked away from that encounter too. Walked away knowing he could attack women and get away with it, knowing the system wasn't going to catch him. And you have to wonder how many other women he attacked over those 35 years. How many other victims are out there who never reported what happened or who reported it, but nothing came of it? Because we only know about Maureen Farag and Roxanne Wood and Rose Caparel. Those are the cases that came to light, but with someone like Patrick Gilham, with his history of violence against women, with his pattern of escalation, it's almost certain there were others, and that brings us to another critical point about this case, about how the criminal justice system handles sex offenders and violent criminals. Because Patrick Gilham was sentenced to 14 years in prison for attacking Maureen Farag, for breaking into her home and trying to rape her. 14 years seems reasonable, right? Seems like adequate punishment. Except he only served 7 years, only half his sentence. Got out early, presumably for good behavior. And 4 months after his release, he murdered Roxanne Wood. 4 months. So ask yourself this: what does good behavior in prison actually mean? Does it mean you're rehabilitated? Does it mean you're safe to release back into society? Or does it just mean you know how to follow rules and keep your head down and not cause problems for guards and administrators? Because clearly, Patrick Gilham's good behavior in prison didn't mean he was reformed, didn't mean he'd addressed whatever was broken inside him that made him attack women, didn't mean he was safe, and Roxanne Wood paid the price for that failure. Paid with her life because the system decided 7 years was enough for someone who'd broken into a home and tried to rape a woman in front of her sleeping children. This case is also a testament to the families who never give up, who keep pushing for answers even when decades pass, even when it seems hopeless. Janet Wood said she never lost hope. Not for one single day in 35 years did she give up believing that eventually they'd catch Roxanne's killer. And Brad Woods kept his sister's memory alive, kept pushing investigators to look at the case again, kept asking questions, kept demanding justice, and their persistence paid off. Their refusal to let Roxanne become just. Another cold case statistic made all the difference, and we have to acknowledge the students at Western Michigan University who processed all those thousands of pages of documents, who created that searchable database that allowed detectives to navigate 35 years of investigation efficiently. Because sometimes solving cases isn't about dramatic breakthroughs or high-tech equipment. Sometimes it's about the boring, tedious work of organizing information, of making data accessible, of creating systems that allow investigators to see patterns and connections they might have missed otherwise. And those students, Samantha Rogers and Mackenzie Storman, and all the others who worked on this case, they played a crucial role in bringing justice for Roxanne. But the real hero of this story, the person who made everything else possible, is Gabriela Vargas, the genetic genealogist who looked at a DNA sample everyone else said was unusable, impossible, too small to generate any meaningful results, and said, "I can solve this." And not only did she solve it, she did it in 4 days. 4 days to trace Patrick Gilham through 200 years of family history. 4 days to give Roxanne's family the answers they'd been waiting 34 years for. 4 days to vindicate Terry Wood and prove once and for all that he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. And Vargas's work on this case has implications far beyond just Roxanne Wood, because she proved that even the smallest DNA samples can be used to solve cases, even samples that are 3% of what genealogists normally work with, even samples that other experts have given up on. There's still hope, there's still a chance. And that means potentially thousands of cold cases around the country could be solved using the same techniques Vargas used here, could be cracked open by genetic genealogists who are willing to look at impossible cases and try anyway. The technology behind genetic genealogy is fascinating and kind of terrifying at the same time, because it works by taking the killer's DNA and using it to find distant relatives who've uploaded their DNA to public databases like GED Match. People who took a 23andMe test or an ancestry test out of curiosity about their family history, never imagining their genetic information might be used to catch a killer. And then, genealogists build family trees going back generations, looking for where different branches connect, looking for union couples, narrowing down possibilities until they can identify the specific individual whose DNA was left at the crime scene. And this raises some interesting questions about privacy and genetic information. Because when you upload your DNA to GED Match and opt into law enforcement matching, you're not just sharing information about yourself. You're potentially sharing information about your entire family tree, about cousins you've never met, about distant relatives who have no idea their genetic information is being used this way. And while most people are probably fine with their DNA being used to catch murderers and rapists, it's worth thinking about the implications, about what happens when this technology becomes even more sophisticated, about who has access to this genetic information and how it can be used. But in this case, in Roxanne Wood's case, the use of genetic genealogy was absolutely justified, absolutely necessary, because without it, Patrick Gilham would still be walking free. He would still be living in South Bend, smoking his cigarettes and pretending he's just a regular guy. And Roxanne's family would still be waiting for answers. And Terry Wood would still be living under that cloud of suspicion. And that's not acceptable, that's not justice. So whatever concerns we might have about genetic privacy, we have to balance those against the very real good that this technology can do, the very real justice it can bring to victims and their families. The sentencing in this case, 23 years minimum for Patrick Gilham, who was 67 at the time, means he'll be 86 years old before he's eligible for parole, means he'll almost certainly die in prison, and that feels like justice, feels like an appropriate punishment for what he did. But it's also worth noting that if he'd been caught back in 1987, if police had responded to Rose Caparel's call and arrested him that night, he would have spent the last 35 years in prison, would have been behind bars this whole time instead of living free. So yes, justice was finally served, but it was delayed justice. Justice that came 35 years too late for Roxanne, 35 years too late for Terry, and 35 years too late for everyone who loved her. And we can't forget about Maureen Farag in all of this. The woman Patrick Gilham attacked back in 1979, who fought him off and survived, and then spent the rest of her life not knowing that the man who attacked her had gone on to kill someone else. Maureen died in 2018 from cancer, 3 years before Gilham was arrested. 3 years before the connection between her attack and Roxanne's murder became clear, and Robert Farag, her husband, had to live with that knowledge, had to know that the man who terrorized his wife, who tried to rape her in their own home, had escalated to murder, and there was probably nothing Maureen or Robert could have done to prevent it. Gilham served his time for attacking Maureen, 7 years in prison, and then he got out and killed Roxanne. And that's not Maureen's fault, that's not Robert's fault, that's the system's fault for releasing a violent sex offender after just 7 years. The dream Janet had about Roxanne, that moment where they're walking through downtown Niles, laughing and talking, and then they end up at the cemetery gates, and Roxanne has to go back, but says she's fine. She's really good. That's the kind of closure that families need after cases like this. That sense that their loved one is at peace, that they can rest knowing justice was finally served. And whether you believe in dreams having deeper meaning, or whether you think it was just Janet's subconscious processing everything that had happened, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it brought her comfort, brought her a sense that Roxanne was okay, that she wasn't suffering anymore, that she could finally let go of some of that grief and pain she'd been carrying for 35 years. This case teaches us so many lessons about criminal justice, about DNA evidence, about the importance of keeping an open mind during investigations, about not letting tunnel vision destroy innocent people's lives, about preserving evidence even when you can't analyze it yet, about never giving up on cold cases, no matter how much time passes, about the power of new technology to solve old crimes, about how genetic genealogy is revolutionizing law enforcement, about how families can wait decades for justice and still keep fighting, still keep believing that someday, somehow the truth will come out. And it teaches us about the ripple effects of violence, about how one murder doesn't just destroy one life. It destroys dozens of lives, hundreds of lives. Roxanne's death destroyed Terry's life for 35 years, destroyed Brad's ability to have his rock, his stable presence in an unstable childhood, destroyed Janet's relationship with her sister, her role model, the person she looked up to more than anyone, destroyed the future children Roxanne and Terry were planning to have, destroyed the life Maureen Farag might have. And if she'd known the man who attacked her was caught and punished properly instead of being released after 7 years to kill someone. Its violence radiates outward like waves in a pond, touching everyone it reaches, changing them, damaging them. And we don't talk about that enough. We focus on the victim, rightfully so, but we forget about all the other victims, the secondary victims, the people who have to live with the aftermath, who have to pick up the pieces, who have to find a way to move forward when everything they knew has been shattered. And this case also shows us the importance of advocacy, of speaking up, of not letting cases go quietly into the night, because if Roxanne's family had given up, if they'd accepted that the case was unsolvable, if they'd stopped pushing for answers, Patrick Gillam would still be free, would still be living his life, would still be getting away with murder literally. But they didn't give up. They kept fighting, kept demanding justice, kept reminding investigators that Roxanne mattered, that her life mattered, that finding her killer mattered, and that's something we can all learn from. That persistence matters, that refusing to accept injustice matters, that keeping someone's memory alive matters, because the alternative is letting killers win, letting them fade into the background, letting them become just another unsolved case file, gathering dust in some evidence room. And that's not acceptable, that's not justice. That's not honoring the victims who lost their lives, the technology that solved this case. Genetic genealogy, it's still relatively new, it's still evolving, and there are legitimate concerns about privacy and consent and how this genetic information is used. But the potential is enormous. The number of cases that could be solved is staggering, and we're just scratching the surface, just beginning to understand what's possible when you combine DNA evidence with genealogical research and public databases and dedicated investigators who refuse to give up. Think about the Golden State Killer, caught in 2018 using genetic genealogy after evading capture for decades, or the boy in the box, a child whose identity was unknown for 65 years until genetic genealogy identified him in 2022, or countless other cases that seemed impossible, unsolvable, hopeless, until someone like Gabriela Vargas looked at them and said, "Let me try. Let me see what I can do with this tiny sample, this impossible case, this decades-old mystery." And every time one of these cases gets solved, it sends a message to criminals who thought they got away with it, who thought they were safe, who thought enough time had passed that they didn't need to worry anymore. It tells them that time doesn't make you safe, that getting away with it for 35 years doesn't mean you got away with it forever, that DNA doesn't have a statute of limitations, that justice might be slow but it's patient, and it's coming for you eventually. Patrick Gilham thought he was safe, thought 35 years was enough time, thought he'd successfully evaded justice. But he was wrong, and now he's going to die in prison. And that's exactly what should happen to people who rape and murder innocent women in their own homes. People who escalate from attempted rape to murder because they learn that leaving witnesses alive gets you caught. People who walk around free for decades while their victims' families suffer and grieve and wait for answers. And Terry Wood, the man who was wrongly suspected for 35 years, who was called Slash by people who should have known better, who lost not only his wife but also his reputation, his peace of mind, his ability to grieve properly. Terry finally got vindication, finally got to hear a detective say, "We know you had nothing to do with it." Finally got to watch as the real killer was sentenced to die in prison. And that vindication matters, that acknowledgement matters, even if it came 35 years too late, because the truth matters. The truth always matters, even when it takes decades to come out, even when it requires new technology and dedicated investigators and genetic genealogists who can do the impossible. Even when it seems hopeless, the truth matters. And finding the truth matters. And bringing justice matters. And this case proves that. Proves that it's never too late. Proves that cold cases can be solved. Proves that families who never give up can eventually get answers. Roxanne Wood was 30 years old when she was murdered on February 19th, 1987. She was tall and statuesque and dressed to the nines. She made everyone feel like they were her best friend. She was Brad's rock and Janet's role model and Terry's wife, and she had her whole life ahead of her. She was looking forward to starting a family, to growing old with her husband, to being an aunt to her siblings' children, to all the normal, beautiful things that make up a life. And Patrick Gilham took all of that from her, took her future, took her dreams, took her life, and he walked free for 35 years while she lay in a cemetery in Niles, Michigan. But now, finally, justice has been served. Patrick Gilham will die in prison. Terry Wood has been vindicated. Roxanne's family has answers, and her story, her case, will help solve other cold cases, will help bring justice to other victims, will help other families who are waiting and wondering and hoping that someday, somehow, they'll get answers too. And that's Roxanne's legacy. That's what her death, as tragic and senseless as it was, has contributed to the world, and maybe, just maybe, that counts for something. Patrick Gilham will be 86 years old in 2040 when he's first eligible for parole. But the truth is, he'll probably never make it that long. He'll probably die in prison long before then. And when he does, when Patrick Gilham takes his last breath in a prison cell, surrounded by guards instead of family, alone instead of loved, Roxanne Wood can finally, truly, completely rest in peace, knowing that justice was served, that the man who killed her paid for what he did, that her family got answers, that her story helped change how cold cases are investigated, and that she's remembered not as a victim, but as a person, as Rock, as the woman who made everyone feel special, who lit up every room she walked into, who was loved deeply by everyone who knew her. And that's how she deserves to be remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. And that's the final lesson of this case, that victims are people first, that their lives matter more than their deaths, that Roxanne Wood was so much more than a murder victim. She was a sister, a wife, a daughter, a friend, a rock, and she deserved better than what Patrick Gilham did to her. But at least now, 38 years later, she has justice, and sometimes that's all we can hope for. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough when we talk about cold cases. The detectives who carry these cases with them for decades. The investigators who go home at night thinking about victims they couldn't help. Families they couldn't give answers to. Killers who got away. Because Detective Chuck Christensen worked Roxanne Wood's case for years, decades even, and you can hear it in his voice when he talks about finally solving it. When he talks about that moment when Gabriela Vargas called and said, "I found him. I know who killed Roxanne Wood." Christensen says he was ecstatic, very, very happy, and that emotion, that relief, that joy, it tells you everything you need to know about how much this case weighed on him. Think about what it must be like to be a homicide detective working cold cases. You're dealing with the worst moments of people's lives. You're seeing crime scene photos that would give most people nightmares. You're interviewing grieving families who are desperate for answers, who look at you with hope in their eyes, thinking maybe you're the one who'll finally figure it out. And then years pass, decades pass, and you still don't have answers. You still can't tell them who killed their loved one. You still can't give them closure, and that weight, that burden, it doesn't just disappear when you clock out at the end of your shift. It follows you home, it keeps you up at night, it makes you wonder what you missed, what you could have done differently, and Detective Christensen wasn't the only one carrying this case. Detective Sergeant John Moore worked on it. Detective Sergeant Jason Bailey worked on it. Detective First Lieutenant Chuck Christensen, who we keep mentioning. All these investigators who spent years, cumulative decades of effort, trying to solve Roxanne's murder, trying to find Patrick Gilham, even though they didn't know his name yet, trying to match that DNA to someone, anyone, trying to give Terry Wood his life back, trying to give Brad and Janet the answers they deserved. And here's something that makes this case even more remarkable: the collaboration between different agencies and different types of experts. You had Michigan State Police working with university professors. You had Dr. Ashlyn Kirsten's criminal justice students at Western Michigan University processing documents. You had genetic genealogy companies like Identifinders International getting involved. You had Gabriela Vargas bringing her specialized expertise. You had undercover surveillance teams collecting cigarette butts. You had lab technicians analyzing microscopic DNA samples. You had prosecutors building the case. You had everyone working together toward the same goal, finding Roxanne's killer. And that collaboration, that willingness to try new approaches, to bring in outside experts, to admit that maybe traditional investigative methods weren't enough for this case. That's what ultimately solved it. Because if Detective Christensen had just kept doing what they'd always done, kept looking at the same evidence the same way, kept hoping that CODIS would eventually get a hit, Patrick Gilham would still be free, would still be living in South Bend, would still be getting away with murder. But Christensen was willing to take a chance on genetic genealogy, was willing to spend money on what seemed like an impossible case, was willing to trust Colleen Fitzpatrick and then Gabriela Vargas when they said, "We can solve this." And that willingness to try something new, to embrace new technology, to think outside the traditional investigative box, that's what changed everything. And it's a lesson that every law enforcement agency in the country should be paying attention to. Because there are thousands of cold cases out there right now, tens of thousands, cases where DNA evidence exists, but there's no match in CODIS. Cases where families have been waiting for answers for decades. Cases where killers are walking free, thinking they got away with it. And genetic genealogy could solve so many of those cases, could bring justice to so many victims, could give so many families the closure they desperately need. But only if law enforcement agencies are willing to invest in it, willing to bring in these experts, willing to try new approaches. And it's not just about the technology, it's about the mindset, about being willing to admit that maybe you don't have all the answers. Maybe you need help from people outside your department. Maybe the traditional ways of doing things aren't working for this particular case. And that takes humility. That takes courage. That takes leadership. And Detective Christensen showed all of those qualities when he reached out to Identifinders International and said, "We need help with this case. We've tried everything we can think of, and we're not getting anywhere. Can you help us?" Now let's talk about the courtroom dynamics, because there's something powerful about victim impact statements. about giving families the opportunity to look their loved one's killer in the eye and tell them exactly what they think, exactly how their actions have destroyed lives. And Janet Wood didn't hold back. She called Patrick Gilham the very definition of a nightmare women fear their whole lives, called him a violent animal who deserves to spend the rest of his life in a cage. And Brad Woods told him not to bother looking for Jesus in prison, because the devil will be the only one greeting him. And those words, that raw emotion, that anger and pain and grief, it matters, because for 35 years, Patrick Gilham thought he won, thought he got away with it, thought he successfully evaded justice. And now here he is, sitting in a courtroom wearing handcuffs, listening to the family of the woman he murdered tell him he's a monster, tell him he's going to die in prison, tell him there's no redemption for what he did, and that has to hurt. That has to break through even the most hardened criminals' defenses, knowing that these people, these strangers who are connected to you only through the worst thing you ever did, they see you for exactly what you are, and they're not afraid to say it out loud in a courtroom for everyone to hear. And Rose Caparel being there, the woman who ran screaming from Gilham back in 1987, the woman whose husband Stan held Gilham at gunpoint, the woman who reported the incident to police only to have them never follow up. She was there too, and when Gilham walked into that courtroom, Rose said "piece of shit" loud enough for people to hear. And that moment, that immediate visceral reaction, it shows that the trauma doesn't go away, that even 35 years later, seeing the man who terrorized you brings all those feelings rushing back. And Robert Farag being there too, Maureen's husband, the man whose wife survived Patrick Gilham's attack back in 1979. He witnessed all of this, saw Terry Wood shaking and crying, felt empathy for him, understood his pain in a way that most people couldn't, because Robert knew what it was like to be victimized by Patrick Gilham, knew what it was like to have your sense of safety shattered, knew what it was like to wonder if the man who attacked your wife would ever face real consequences. The courtroom is supposed to be this neutral space where justice is administered dispassionately, but in reality, it's where raw human emotion collides with legal procedure, where families finally get to say things they've been holding inside for decades, where killers have to sit there and listen to the damage they've caused, where judges have to balance punishment with the law, where everyone involved in this tragedy comes together one last time before the killer is led away and the family goes home to try to rebuild their lives. And Gilham's apology, his statement about praying for the family every night, about hoping they can forgive him someday with God's help, it rings so hollow, so empty, so performative, because if he really felt that remorse, if he really understood the magnitude of what he did, he would have turned himself in years ago, decades ago. He wouldn't have waited until he was caught, until the DNA evidence was undeniable, until he had no choice but to face justice. Real remorse means taking responsibility without being forced to, means confessing because it's the right thing to do, not because you got caught. But Patrick Gilham only started talking about remorse and prayer and forgiveness after he was arrested, after the evidence against him was overwhelming, after he realized there was no way out. And that kind of remorse, that kind of apology, it's not about the victims, it's about the perpetrator. It's about trying to make himself look better, trying to get a lighter sentence, trying to manipulate people's emotions. And the Wood family saw right through it. They weren't buying what he was selling. Now let's think about the broader implications for other families with missing or murdered loved ones. Because when the Wood family heard that Roxanne's case had been solved using genetic genealogy, when they heard that this impossible case with a microscopic DNA sample had been cracked in 4 days, that must have given hope to thousands of other families. Families who've been told their cases are unsolvable. Families who've been waiting decades for answers. Families who've almost given up hope that they'll ever know what happened to their loved one. And that hope is powerful. That hope is valuable. That hope keeps people going when everything else says to give up. Because if Roxanne Wood's case could be solved after 34 years with a DNA sample the size of a gnat's eyebrow, then maybe other cases can be solved too. Maybe other families can get answers. Maybe other killers can be caught. Maybe justice isn't as impossible as it sometimes seems, and we're seeing this happen more and more. Genetic genealogy is solving cases that were considered unsolvable. Cases where traditional investigative methods had been exhausted. Cases where the DNA was in CODIS for years without getting a hit. Cases where families had given up hope. And suddenly, because of this technology, because of dedicated genetic genealogists like Gabriela Vargas, because of law enforcement agencies willing to try new approaches, these cases are being solved. These families are getting answers. These killers are being caught. Roxanne Wood mattered. She matters still. She'll always matter. And the fact that her case was solved 34 years after her murder proves that time doesn't diminish the importance of seeking justice. Doesn't diminish the value of a human life. Doesn't mean we just shrug and say, well, it's been too long. Nothing we can do now. No, we keep fighting. We keep investigating. We keep trying new approaches until we find the truth, until we catch the killer, until we give the family answers. And Patrick Gilham, sitting in prison right now, knowing he's going to die there, knowing he'll never be free again, knowing the world knows what he did, knowing he's been exposed as the monster he always was. That's justice. That's accountability. That's what happens when dedicated investigators refuse to give up. When genetic genealogists do the impossible, when families keep pushing for answers, when everyone involved in the case works together toward the same goal, Terry Wood can finally grieve his wife properly, can finally move forward without that cloud of suspicion hanging over him, can finally be seen as the victim he always was, instead of the suspect investigators wanted him to be. And that vindication, that acknowledgement, it can't give him back the 35 years he lost, can't undo the damage to his reputation, can't erase the pain of being called slash by people who should have known better, but it's something. It's justice. It's the truth finally coming out, and maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that the truth always matters, that finding the truth is always worth the effort, that justice delayed is better than justice denied, that it's never too late to solve a case, never too late to catch a killer, never too late to give a family answers, never too late to vindicate an innocent person, never too late to prove that victims matter, that their lives had value, that someone cared enough to keep fighting for them long after everyone else had moved on. Roxanne Wood. Rock, the woman who made everyone feel special, who lit up every room, who was her brother's rock and her sister's role model, who had her whole life ahead of her, who deserved so much better than what Patrick Gilham did to her. She finally has justice, and that justice, that truth, that acknowledgement that her life mattered and her death wasn't in vain, that's her legacy. That's what remains after all the pain and grief and decades of waiting. And it's a legacy worth celebrating, worth remembering, worth honoring, because Roxanne Wood mattered then. Matters now, will always matter, and nobody, not even Patrick Gilham, not even 38 years of him walking free, can ever take that away from her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.